Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why you absolutely crave that sugary snack after a long day? Or why a simple apple feels so different from a burger in your mind? Well, new research dives deep into how we actually think about food, and it is more complex than you might guess. Think about it. We know a tomato is technically a fruit, but we practically always use it like a vegetable. Why? Because our brains don't just see food as a collection of calories or a pretty picture. It's a whole package of taste, smell, where it comes from, how we prepare it, and even what our culture tells us it is. Scientists are trying to map out this incredibly rich food knowledge in our brains. Traditionally, science has looked at food in two main ways. One way is through nutrition: calories, fats, carbs. This is super important for our bodies, but it doesn't always explain why we choose what we choose. The other way is by looking at how food looks, like recognizing an apple on a shelf. But again, that doesn't explain why an apple can feel more like a snack than a meal. This new study asks a big question. Is there a way to understand how we really think about food, a way that goes beyond just how it looks or what is in it? And here is another fascinating part. How does the way we think about food connect to how we think about everything else? Are the food categories just a small part of a bigger picture of all objects, or is there something special, something unique to how we mentally organize food? So, how did they tackle this giant question? They gathered 68 different food items. They wanted foods that had clear nutritional profiles, but also foods that people often think about when they're considering things like taste and enjoyment. To make sure they covered all the bases, they took really nice, clear photos of each food and also wrote down their names. Then, they played a game with people. Imagine you see 3 foods. Your job is to pick the one that just doesn't belong with the other 2. For example, if you see an apple, a banana, and a steak, you'd probably pick the steak, right? They did this with tons and tons of different food combinations, showing people either the pictures or just the words for the foods. This forced people to really think about what makes food similar or different. Now, analyzing all those odd one-out choices is tricky. That is where a cool computer model called VICE comes in. It is like a super smart detective that looks at all the choices people made and tries to figure out the hidden dimensions or underlying traits that explain why people made those choices. Imagine a giant map where each food is placed. VICE helps draw this map by finding the invisible lines that group certain foods together. They ran this model separately for the picture choices and the word choices. Here is the mind-blowing part. After running VICE on both the picture choices and the word choices, they looked for the dimensions, those invisible lines on the map that showed up in both sets of choices. If a dimension was important for deciding if a picture of a cookie was similar to a picture of a cake, and it was also important for deciding if the word cookie was similar to the word cake, then that dimension is considered format-invariant, meaning it is about the food itself, not just what it looks like or how it is written. They found 9 of these format-invariant dimensions. They gave them cool descriptive names based on what foods loaded onto them. Think sweet dessert, healthy produce, meat, protein, and things like that. These 9 dimensions are the core way our brains seem to organize food concepts. No matter if we see a picture or read a word, and get these 9 dimensions together explained almost all the predictable choices people made in the odd one out game. When they tried using other information like nutritional content, simple image features, or even just what people explicitly said about food properties, these other models just couldn't compete with the dimensions VICE found. This is huge. It means our brains are using these deeper conceptual dimensions to make similarity judgments, not just the obvious stuff like calories or color. The study showed that models based on nutrient composition, or even just low-level image statistics, performed way worse than the VICE dimensions, even detailed human ratings of food properties. While helpful for understanding the dimensions, didn't capture the whole story as well as these hidden dimensions did. And what are these dimensions? They found that sweet dessert really tracks how sweet and sugary foods are perceived. Healthy. Produce is strongly linked to healthiness and naturalness. Starchy, savory is all about savory tastes, meat. Protein connects to protein content and savory qualities. It is like VICE uncovered the secret recipe our brains use to categorize food. Even things like baked breaded strongly link to fat and calories, showing these abstract dimensions map onto real-world properties. Now remember that question about how food knowledge fits into our overall understanding of objects. The researchers compared these food dimensions to a massive map of general object knowledge. They found some overlap, for instance, plant-based foods grouping with green properties. But crucially, many of the food-specific dimensions like meat, protein, or baked breaded didn't map neatly onto the general object map. This tells us that while food knowledge is part of broader object understanding, it also has its own unique specialized structure. To make sure these findings weren't just a fluke of the specific foods they picked, they tested their dimensions on completely separate sets of food images. And guess what? The dimensions they found held up. They were able to predict similarity judgments in these new datasets, proving that these dimensions are robust and capture something real about how we understand food in general. They also looked at how these dimensions are used. They found different dimensions play different roles. Some dimensions like sweet, dessert, and starchy savory are really good at separating big categories. Others like fruit or meat protein are more like specialists, particularly good at telling apart foods within a specific category. Some dimensions, like baked breaded, act as bridges, cutting across categories based on preparation. Perhaps the most surprising finding is how our food similarity is structured. It is not just a simple tree with branches or a few main categories. Instead, it's more like a continuous, multi-scale map. There are broad dimensions that divide things up, but there are also finer details and connections that create a more complex, nuanced understanding. Think of it like looking at a world map versus looking at a city map. Both are useful, but they operate at different levels of detail. It is not a strict hierarchy, but a more fluid, multi-dimensional space. So, what is the big takeaway from all this? Our brains build a rich, multi-dimensional map of food knowledge. This map is surprisingly consistent, whether we're looking at pictures or reading words, and it goes way beyond just nutrition or appearance. It's a system that combines broad distinctions with finer details, making our food judgments flexible and context-dependent. An exciting implication is that how we organize food knowledge might change depending on what we're comparing. When we're just thinking about food, we focus on food-specific ideas like taste and preparation. But if we were comparing a banana to a sneaker, then a general food vs non-food distinction might become much more important. This suggests our mental maps aren't fixed points, but dynamic tools that adapt to the task at hand. Interestingly, the study highlighted that some judgments are much harder and more varied between people, especially when foods come from very different categories. This variability might actually be a window into our individual differences. Things like our personal tastes, our cultural background, or even our current mood might subtly shift how we weigh these different food dimensions, leading to those more ambiguous choices. And like any good scientist, they acknowledge that their study was done with foods common in a Western diet. The emphasis on healthy dimensions, for example, might be very specific to our current cultural conversations about food. In other parts of the world, or at different times in history, different organizational principles might be more prominent. Food knowledge is adaptive, and our brains are amazing at shaping it to fit our environment and diet. In conclusion, this research paints a fascinating picture of our inner food world. It is a place built on interconnected semantic dimensions that help us understand not just what food is, but how it relates to all other foods in meaningful ways. They've shown that our food brains are complex, context-sensitive, and far more intricate than simply listing ingredients. What do you think about these findings? Does it change how you think about your own food choices? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into the science of food, please give this video a big thumbs up, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the human mind. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.